Right, so this video is for the second semester students. Since I could not take online classes, I decided to make pre-recorded videos and send it to the students. Right, so this class is about Matthew Arnold's Culture and Anarchy, and if you have any doubts regarding this video, right, specifically what I taught in this video, you could contact me, preferably through email if you have any questions. Right. If you have any questions, send me a mail or send me a message through Facebook. I don't have WhatsApp, so you can send me a question from any means that you have. Right. I'll try my best to answer all your questions. Right. So I have already provided you the written materials, a PPT designed to help you in understanding Matthew Arnold's cultural philosophy. I've sent you a PPT. I've also sent to one of your classmates, one of the students, I've also sent a PDF copy, a soft copy of the primary text that I will be referring to. Right? So the text that I am referring to is one of the very first editions of Matthew Arnold's Culture and Anarchy. Right? It's a Cambridge edition, right? Edited by J. Dover Wilson. J. Dover, 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 Dover Wilson, Wilson. J. Dover Wilson. There's an excellent introduction given by J. Dover Wilson, which gives you basically the entire historical, political background of Victorian England. Right? Which is very significant in trying to understand the cultural philosophy of Matthew Arnold. Right? The very concept of anarchy, for example, comes from this political, cultural unrest that you find in the 19th century, in the Victorian era England. Right? So please go through the introduction. I mainly, whenever I've taught Culture and Anarchy, I've mainly concentrated on the first chapter of Culture and Anarchy, which is Sweetness and Light. Right? I usually only do the first chapter in detail. Right? I'll give you a historical, political background. Right? I'll give you biographical details of Matthew Arnold because they are very important for you to understand. Right? The influences that you find from his own life. Right. So I usually do only the first chapter in detail, Sweetness and Light, and I give a basic idea of the rest of the chapters. Right. Whether it is about Philistines, right? Philistines, barbarians, and the populace. Right? There's a chapter based on the divisions of society, the three divisions of society. Right? The aristocracy, the middle classes, and the lower classes. Right? The unskilled workers, laborers. Right? So there are a lot of other chapters that I won't be doing in detail. I'll mainly be concentrated on the first chapter of Culture and Anarchy because it is in there that you find the basic idea of culture propounded by Matthew Arnold, provided by Matthew Arnold. Basic idea of culture appears in the very first chapter of Culture and Anarchy, which is Sweetness and Light. Right. So two things you have to understand in order to make sense of the cultural theories of Matthew Arnold. Right? Mainly two things. Right? One is the very upbringing of Matthew Arnold. Right? It is a significant part of his cultural philosophy. Right? The basic influences that were formed during his upbringing. Right? This formed a major part of his psyche as a whole. Right? One are I'll give you the biographical details. That is one part. Right? The very upbringing is important. His life as he has led, right? That is very important in trying to understand the philosophy of Matthew Arnold. The second is the historical political background of Victorian era England. Right? Both are significant. Right? In terms of biographical details, you have to understand, for example, the influence of Thomas Arnold, right? The father of Matthew Arnold. Right? Thomas Arnold was a major formative influence on Matthew Arnold. Right? Thomas Arnold was a primary influence on Matthew Arnold. Right? Right. So Thomas Arnold essentially Thomas Arnold's influence is found essentially when Matthew Arnold talks about education. Right? Education is at the very center of Matthew Arnold's philosophy. Right? You can't talk about any of the theories of Matthew Arnold without looking at the educational aspect of it. Right? Education is given primary importance when you talk about Matthew Arnold's cultural theories. Right? So Thomas Arnold was the headmaster of Rugby School. Right? Right? He's the headmaster. He was the headmaster of Rugby School. Right? Rugby, Rugby School. Right? He was the headmaster of Rugby School. Right? And Rugby School, the kind of curriculum that Thomas Arnold designed, right? The kind of curriculum that Thomas Arnold designed, right, to be taught in Rugby School is very important, right? Because the concentration of that entire curriculum, unlike our curriculum or the curriculum that you find in some of our own public schools, right? In fact, Thomas Arnold created, right? He entirely created what you know as the public school system today in England, right? The entire public school system was created in a sense by Thomas Arnold, because many of the other schools, prominent schools, started emulating, started copying the kind of curriculum that Thomas Arnold was using. So what was the main emphasis of the curriculum that Thomas Arnold designed? Right? The curriculum of Rugby School focused primarily on moral character, right? Improving moral character, right? It was designed to teach the students gentlemanly conduct, right? Academic abilities, on the other hand, right, were secondary, right? There were three parts to the curriculum that you found in Rugby School, right? One was moral education. The second was character building, right? Gentlemanly conduct, right? The third, right, was academic abilities, right? So more focus was given on moral character, right? Moral character, instead of only looking at the academic abilities of the students, right? they were mainly secondary qualities, right? Secondary part of the curriculum. What was important was moral education, right? So remember this point, because later on this will have a profound influence on Matthew Arnold, right? Education is also important for Matthew Arnold, because Matthew Arnold was appointed as Her Majesty's Inspector of Schools in 1851. Right? 1851, he was appointed as Her Majesty's Inspector of Schools. Right? As you already know, the job description of the inspector of school, right? He would go to different parts of the country, right? Different parts of the country, mainly, right? Mainly, at least in the early years of his employment, he would travel mainly to rural areas, the countryside of England, right? He would go to the countryside, and he would mainly go to the middle class non-conformist schools, right? He would go there, the children of middle class non-conformist people, right? The schools that they went to, right? He would go there and he would inspect, right? Whether it is the curriculum, right, of the school, right? Right. So that is what Matthew Arnold's job was, right? But the education system itself in the 19th century underwent a lot of changes, right? A lot of changes, mainly due to the Newcastle report, right? Mainly due to the Newcastle report. If you have any doubts, you can go to the PPT and check out whatever I am saying, right? You check the points, right? The Newcastle report, right? In fact, in drafting the Newcastle report, right, Matthew Arnold was instrumental, because Matthew Arnold had to travel all over Europe, right? He went to France, right? He went to Holland, right? Holland, France. He went to these places and he studied the school system, right? He studied the school system, and you'll find a lot of non-fictional work, right, that he had written on his visits to these places, right? So education was very important, right, in the general scheme of his philosophies, right? He was Her Majesty's Inspector of Schools, and he was the professor. He was appointed a professor of poetry in 1857, right? In 1857 he was appointed professor of poetry at Oxford, right? At Oxford, which he held, the post he held for 10 years, right? He held the post for 10 years. It is during that period, right, that he collected these materials that later became Culture and Anarchy, right? During this period he traveled to different places and he gave lectures. Those lectures are compiled, right, collected, and those lectures formed a major part of the text that you have in your syllabus, Culture and Anarchy. Culture and Anarchy was published in 1869, right? So biographical details the influence of the father, right? Father's educational policy, right? The curriculum in rugby school, right? Also there was a kind of religious fervor, right? There was a kind of religious fervor that you found in Thomas Arnold, right? The religion was important, right? Religion was more important, for example, than natural sciences, right? Religion, philosophy, right? They were more important for Thomas Arnold than natural sciences, right? What you call today the sciences, right? So philosophy, the emphasis on philosophy, the emphasis on religion, right, also played a major role in the philosophy of Matthew Arnold, right? Right. So you have a part of the biographical details, at least one other significant uh, aspect of his life was the Tractarian movement, or the Oxford movement, right? The Tractarian movement or the Oxford movement, right? This was an important event which was tracked by Matthew Arnold. Matthew Arnold kept track of this entire movement, which called for reformation of the rituals of the church, right? The Anglican Church, right? Right. So this was another important point that you find, that you can say is an influence on the philosophy of Matthew Arnold, right? The other influence, right, are the widespread changes that were happening in the 19th century Victorian society, right? So 19th century Victorian society was characterized, right, most famously by Disraeli as two nations. Right? This entire concept of two nations was that there was a significant significant uh, a significant class of people who were the have-nots, and there was a class of people, right, relatively less in number, who were the haves, right? The haves and the have-nots. This entire conflict between, right, the haves and the have-nots formed this concept of the two nations, right? So Victorian England is characterized by this concept of two nations, right? Even before Queen Victoria came onto the throne, even during what you call in literature as the Romantic period, even in that period, you'll find a lot of social unrest. Right? There was a lot of social unrest during the period that we usually term as the Romantic period. Right? Even in the Romantic period, for example, right, after the defeat of Napoleon, right, many of the English soldiers who came back to England, right, had no means of survival. Right? They protested, right? They protested, right? And many of the people were shot down. Right? Many of the people were shot down. Right? So this happened during the first half of 19th century. Right? There was a lot of economic progress. There was a lot of economic progress during that time because of, as you know, colonization. Right? There was a lot of economic progress, right? But at the same time, right, this economic progress that you found, right, in England also helped in reinforcing many of the class divisions that were already prevalent in England. Right? It reinforced, right, made much stronger, this much sharper the class distinction that you found in England in the 19th century. Right? So I don't think I've taught. Uh, I don't think I taught you Addison, but those who have a little bit of idea on Addison and Steele, right? Addison and Steele will remember, right, they will remember the character of Roger de Coverley. Right? Roger de Coverley, the character of Roger de Coverley, right? Coverley Papers. Right? You had that in your syllabus in the uh, first semester. Right? So that character that you found, he was what you call, right, a part of the landed gentry, right? Landed gentry, right? Gentry, landed gentry. The landed gentry were the people who essentially controlled, right, the politics, right, the society of England, right, in previous centuries, right. And these were the people, right, the landed gentry were the people who slowly shifted, right. Landed gentry usually were people who had a significant amount of land holdings, and they would have tenants, right. They were the landlords, and they would have tenants who would stay on that land, right. There'll be churches, there'll be all kinds of provisions on that land, right. So these were the landed gentry, and the landed gentry were the people who slowly shifted to the industrial uh, uh, side of England, right? These were the people who started buying industries, right? Started becoming owners of industries, large industries and factories, right? So slowly, many of the people from the countryside also started shifting to the major cities, right? London, Liverpool, right? Birmingham. These were the major cities where all the industries and the factories were located. In search of job, the country folk had to migrate, started migrating in huge numbers, in fact, to the cities in search of jobs, right. This period is also characterized by the rise of the middle classes, right. As I already told you, the class system was sharpened during this time, right. So you had slowly uh, a class of people, the middle classes, were slowly becoming more and more powerful during the 19th century. Right? So it was considered characterized, the period is characterized by the rise of the middle classes. Right? Rise of the middle classes. Right? These were essentially the skilled experts, right? They were the experts, university educated experts, right? Engineers, doctors, right? Professors, right? Teachers, professors, engineers, doctors, right? These were usually, they became managers of factories and industries, right? This was your skilled workforce, the middle classes, right? The middle classes, right? And then you had the lower classes, right? Then you had the lower classes, right? The unskilled laborers, right? The unskilled laborers, right? The political climate of 19th century was influenced by the middle classes, right? And also by the actions of these lower classes, the unskilled workers, right? There were in fact no labor laws, right? No labor laws during the 19th century, right? So the unskilled laborers were actually paid much less, right? There were less wages, more work, right? That was how the condition of the lower classes was in the 19th century, right? At the peak of industrial revolution, right? Peak of industrial revolution, right? The middle classes were the people who were wanted increased representation in the 19th century because they were becoming much more powerful. They wanted increased representation, right, in English legislatures, right? They wanted much more representation, right? Political representation, right? It is only because of them that you find the 1832 Reform Act, right? 1832 Reform Act, Right? Right? There was a bill, a reform bill that was passed. Right? It came into effect in 1832. Right? This is called the 1832 Reform Act. Right? 1832 Reform Act, where a significant part of the male population, right, were given voting rights. Right? A significant part of the male population were given voting rights. Right? 1832 Reform Act. Right? A significant part of the middle class male population. Right? Middle class male population, remember that, because the lower classes, right, the male or female doesn't matter, right, the lower classes were not given the right to vote during that time. Right? They were not given the right to vote during the 19th century. Right? Women did not get the right to vote in the 19th century. Right? Women only got the right to vote in the 20th century after a lot of struggle. Right? So 1832 Reform Bill gave voting rights to certain section of society, right, of male population. Right? Essentially, these were the people who had some amount of land holding. Right? Some amount of land holding. Right? As you know, in today's world, or even then, not everyone could afford to have land holdings. Right? So people who had sufficient amount of land holdings, right, were given the voting rights. Right? The lower classes were excluded, the women were excluded. Right? Right. The other significant uh, political event was the 1867 Reform Act. 1867 Reform Act. 1832 Reform Act. Right? There was a second Reform Act in 1867. Right? 1867 Reform Act. In 1867, due to, right, due to mainly due to the Hyde Park protest, right, mainly due to the Hyde Park protest, HYDE, 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 Hyde Park protest, right, in 1866, right, mainly due to that, right, there was another Reform Act that was passed, right, Hyde Park revolt essentially was where a peaceful group of lower class people, right, suddenly became violent, right, and started taking off the barricades of Hyde Park. Hyde Park usually was reserved for mainly the upper classes of upper class of people, right, who would go there to the park. It was not open for the lower classes. So these people suddenly became violent and they took off the barricades of the park, right? And this essentially gave birth to what you call the 1867 Reform Act, right? 1867 Reform Act, another significant part of the population, male population again, right, were given voting rights, right? Why now, when you are in a democracy, right, when you are in a democracy, right, it is important that everyone has voting rights. India, for example, right, just after, uh, even before independence, everyone had voting rights in India. Right? Women did not have to struggle for voting rights. The lower classes did not have to struggle for voting rights in India. Right? But that is the basis of democracy. Right? Many of the cultural political theories of Matthew Arnold, right, may be problematic. Right? So it is problematic uh, uh, for it is problematic. The cultural philosophies of Matthew Arnold are problematic because they are mostly against the kind of democracy that we find today. Right? In a democracy, everyone has the right to vote. Right? But Matthew Arnold believed that the lower classes should not, in fact, many of the middle class people should not be allowed to vote. Right? This might be controversial, but what is the reason behind it? Why doesn't he want these people to vote? Right? You might find uh, one major influence on this kind of a point of view has been there, right? Already existent, right? It was already there. This kind of controversial view that not everyone should be allowed to vote, right, in a society. Right? You find that in Plato as well, right? Plato also talked about this, right? Plato, as you know, if you read the Republic, Plato advocated a kind of uh, dictatorship, right? Right. The society that he envisions is essentially a kind of